In this video, we are going to discuss what are OpenAI batch requests and how OpenAI batch requests can reduce the cost of tokens. Then I'll also give you a demo of how we can create a batch request file, how we can combine all those requests into a single file, and then we will submit it to the OpenAI API, and later we will get the result of that submitted batch request. So let's get started. First, what are batch requests? Batch requests are actually asynchronous group of calls you are sending to the API, and that reduce the cost by 50%. So there are two types of requests. One type of request is that when you send a request to any third-party service and you are dependent on the response of that request. So you wait for the third-party response, and once you get the response, then you move to the next lines of the code. And the other type is asynchronous, and asynchronous is used when you don't need the response immediately, but you just need to submit your request, and then later you can check if the request was successful or if the data was processed or not. So batch requests are actually the form of asynchronous request, but in the case of batch, you are combining your multiple requests into just a single request, and then through that single request you are submitting all those requests in one go. So as I mentioned that the batch requests are asynchronous, and asynchronous requests are ideal when you don't need the response immediately. The use cases of the batch request in the case of OpenAI API could be running evaluations. So you may have like a bunch of data, and if you are using synchronous request and you are submitting that data and then waiting for the response, it could take maybe some minutes or maybe take some hours. And in case of synchronous request, since the token limits are lower than the batch request, it will also cost you a lot more than the batch request. The other use case is classifying large data sets. So if you have some large data set and you want to do the classification of that large data set, you can just submit it to the OpenAI API in the form of batch, and then later you can check the classification of that data set. The other thing is maybe you have like hundreds of or dozens of articles and you want to summarize all those articles. So instead of looping through all those articles in synchronous mode and then waiting for each API call and getting the summarizations, so if you don't need the response or the summary of each article or the translations immediately, you can just submit all those articles or documents to the OpenAI API, and then later you can check the status of those article summarizations. So the benefits are better cost efficiency. So in 1 second I'll show you the cost of sending requests and consuming tokens in the normal request, and also sending and consuming the tokens in the form of batch requests. In the case of batch requests, the rate limits are much more higher than the normal request. The other thing is fast completion times. So fast completion doesn't mean that it can take like nanoseconds. That means that when you submit your batch request job, it will be completed within 24 hours or before that. So now I'll quickly move to the OpenAI pricing, and we will go through the pricing of batch requests and also the normal requests. So you can see here the pricing of OpenAI, and here I am on the GPT-4o, and the pricing is $5 per 1 million tokens when you are sending synchronous requests, and when you are sending requests through the batch API, the cost is reduced by 50%. So here it's $5 per 1 million tokens, and here it's $2.5 per 1 million tokens. Same you can check for the output tokens. The cost is $15, but in case of batch request, cost is reduced by 50% and it's $7.5. Same way you can check all other models, and for each model the price will be 50% lower than the actual price of that model when we are sending synchronous requests. So this way, when you don't need the response immediately from an OpenAI request, you can utilize batch API. It will reduce your cost by 50% in terms of consuming tokens. Now let's quickly go through the batch request steps. So how we prepare and how we submit the batch request, and then I'll show you a practical demo of how we can prepare or file for the batch request and how we can submit and monitor our batch request job. So the first step is that you collect a set of requests into a single file, and that file will be the JSON-L format. format. On every line you will have one request formatted the way you are sending a request to a GPT model. Once you collect all your requests into a single file, then you kick off the batch processing job. So you just submit that job to the OpenAI API, and rest of the stuff OpenAI will handle all that processing. And then once you submit your batch request job, you can check the status of your batch job continuously. So within 24 hours your batch request should be completed. Then once the status is completed, you can start getting the actual results or the actual response for each request. So you will combine all those requests into a file, and every line will have one request. So you will get the response. You will have a response for each request accordingly. So now let's go to the demo part and see how we can prepare our batch request and how we can submit, and then later we can get the response. So here I'm in the Jupyter notebook and I have set up the Python virtual environment. I have installed the OpenAI API and all the required things. So the environment is ready and we can start submitting our batch requests. First step is to prepare our batch request file. So I'll call it prepare batch requests file. And now what I'll do is that I'll go to file, I'll move to new and then a text file. So in this text file I'll paste my batch of requests. So here I have two requests in the form of batch, and if you can see here I'm passing a custom ID here. I'm just calling it request1. You can name it with any custom name. Then I'm setting the method to post. Then I'm setting the request URL to URL chat completion, which is the URL for the chat completion. And then I'm setting the body, and in the body I'm setting the model to GPT 3.5 turbo. Then I'm setting the messages the same way we were setting the messages to role system and then content, and then we have role user, and then we have content when we were working with the OpenAI basics for the chat completion. So this is exactly that same thing. So we are setting the messages like the chat completion here. We are also setting the model, we are also setting the URL and the method, and the same way we are preparing that second request, which I am calling request 2. In the first request I am setting the role system, and then I'm asking the GPT model that you are a helpful assistant. And then here this is my first question, that who was the first person landed on the moon, and the max token this request can use is 1000. And then in the second request I'm repeating that same stuff. I'm asking the GPT model that you are an unhelpful assistant. You can set the assistant message to whatever you want. And then in the user I'm asking how long does it take to reach the Mars. So the same way you can format your every request. You can add here like hundreds of requests, and the limit for the number of requests in a single file is 50,000. So in this one file you can collect 50,000 requests the same way I have added these two requests here. But you need to make sure that this file size does not exceed 100 MB of size. So now I'll save this file and I'll call it batch.jsonl. So the file format must be in the JSONL, since OpenAI accepts all files in the form of JSONL, if you guys have seen when we were working with the fine-tuning model. So now the file is created and I can see here I have these two requests. So now if I can show you here the actual file, I'll just do cat batch.jsonl, and you guys can see the actual content of that batch.json file. So this was the first step, preparing your batch request file. So this has this specific syntax, you need to follow it. You also need to make sure that you are not exceeding the maximum request limit per file, which is 50,000. You also need to make sure that your batch file size does not exceed 100 MB of file size. Now I'll move to the next step, and the next step is uploading this batch request file to the OpenAI API. So now using the OpenAI client from here, I'll submit this batch.jsonl file to the OpenAI API. Once this file is uploaded, then we can start our batch request processing job. Every time you are working with files with the OpenAI, you first need to upload your file to the OpenAI platform, and once that file is uploaded, you will get a file ID, and once you get that file ID, then you can submit your next request. So that request can be either for processing your batch request or either you are fine-tuning for the training data file. So I'll paste this snippet here, client.files.create. So what this snippet will do is that it will pick this batch.jsonl file from this local directory and it will upload it to the OpenAI file system. and the purpose of this file is batch. So if you guys remember from the fine-tuning video, we were exactly using this same client.files.create, and we were uploading or training data file from our local system, but the purpose here was fine-tuning. And now since we are uploading this file for the batch processing, we are setting the purpose to batch. Let's execute this. So once this is executed, you can print the response here to see what we have got in the response. So we have this unique random ID, then we have file size, then we have also the purpose and what is the status. So this file is processed. This means that this file is successfully uploaded to the OpenAI file system. Now what we need from this response is that we just need this file ID, because we will be referring to this file ID when we are starting our batch request file on the OpenAI platform. I'll extract this file ID by using batch file ID, and then from this batch file, which is the response, I'm extracting this ID here, and then let's print the batch file ID, and we have got exactly this batch file ID. Now we will move to the next step. So the next step is creating our batch request job. So in this step, what we will do is that we will submit a job to the OpenAI API, and we will request to this batch.jsonl file by using this batch file ID. So if you guys remember from the fine tuning, these are almost the same steps we have already followed in the fine tuning video. So in the fine tuning, we also repeated the same step. We prepared a file, we uploaded a file, then we referred to that file, and we started processing the fine tuning job. And in this case, first we prepared the file, then we uploaded that file to the OpenAI file system, and now we are creating the batch job to start processing our batch request. So I'll paste this snippet here, client.batches.create, and here I'm referring to this batch file ID which I have extracted here. This batch file ID was extracted from the file upload response, and the endpoint I am submitting is version 1 chat.completion, and the completion window is 24 hours. So currently it only supports 24 hours. So in the future, if the OpenAI can process the batch of request maybe in less time, then there could be option like maybe 8 hours, 16 hours, or maybe 48 hours. But for now, the completion window can only be set to 24 hours. Let's execute this. So now this job is started asynchronously, and in the response, we don't have any information of what is the current status of our batch of request. To check the status of your batch request, you need to continuously monitor this batch job which we have just submitted. From the batch job, once that is completed, you will get an output file ID. So what we will do now is that we will check the status of this batch job and see what is the current status, and if we can get the output file ID from there. So that output file ID will be actually used for getting the actual response file from the OpenAI. So the next step is checking the status of the batch. In this step, we will check the status of this batch job which we have submitted here. And to get the status of this batch job, we need this batch ID which we have got from this response here. So I'll extract exactly this batch ID from the batch job response. So here I am setting this batch job ID to batch job.id, and this will extract exactly this batch underscore ct2 in this random number, and we'll keep it in the batch job ID. So in the next step, when we are checking the status of the batch job, we will use this batch job ID. So I'll paste the code here for getting the status of our batch job. So I'm checking here client.batches.retrieve. So what it will do is that it will get the response for this batch job by using this batch job ID. So now let's execute this and see what we have got in the response. So here you can see this batch job ID is matching with the initial job we submitted, and what we are interested in this response is this output file ID. What the OpenAI does, that the OpenAI actually write down all your responses into a file. So the same way you submitted your request in the form of batch, the same way the OpenAI will write all your responses into a file in the form of batch. When you submit the batch of request to the OpenAI API, OpenAI API actually loop through all those requests. So the same way when we get the response in the form of batch, we will loop through all those responses and we will get individual responses accordingly. But before getting the output file ID, you need to check the status. So the status must be completed, but the status can be in any of these status values. It could be either validating. So when you initially submit your batch job here, it will be in the validating waiting, and if there is any invalid data, the batch job will be failed. And if your batch request file is valid, then it will move to the in progress, and once it's near the completion, it will be in the finalizing, and once it is completed successfully, the status will be converted to completed. The OpenAI API will keep these jobs for a while, so if the batch job expires maybe after some time, then the status will be converted to expired, and if you cancel this job manually, the batch job could be in one of these statuses, either canceling or either cancelled. So now what we will do is that since the status is completed and we should have all our responses in the response file, to get the response file we will use this output file ID from here. So what I'll do is that I'll extract this output file ID from this batch job response. Here I'm getting the output file ID by using batch job dot output file ID. We didn't get this output file ID from our initial batch job response because at that time the status was validating and we didn't have any output file ID. So if you can check here, we only have input file ID, but we don't have any output file ID. It is set to none. That is why you need to check back later the status of your job, and once the status is completed, then you can see that the output file ID should be set to some random number. So now I'll extract this output file ID into the variable called output file ID. Now we can use this output file ID to get our actual file from the OpenAI API. So the last step is retrieving the results. So just to revise quickly, first we prepared our batch request file in the form of JSON including all the requests. Then we uploaded that file to the OpenAI file system, and once that file was uploaded, we referred to that file and we started a batch processing job on the OpenAI. And once we created that batch job, we started checking the status of that batch file, and once the status of that batch file was converted to completed and we have the output file ID, now we are getting the actual responses for that batch of requests. So we will use this output file ID to get the response file from the OpenAI API. For that, what I'll do is that I'll paste my code snippet here, client.files.content. So this method is used to retrieve the file content from the OpenAI API. Here I am passing this output file ID which I have extracted here from the batch job response. Here in the batch response, I should have all the responses for all the requests we have submitted in the form of batch. So now let's print it and see all the responses. So here you can see we submitted 2 requests and we have exactly got 2 responses. So this is the first response and this is the second response. So here this is the first response and we have got some random ID. Then we have got the ID we have passed to the request 1, and here this is the actual response. So the status code is 200, and then if we go to the body and then we go to the choices, so the response is in the same format. We are getting a response from the chat completion API. So in the choices we have a list of responses, and in the first element we have this message. So this is the role assistant, and the content is what the assistant has replied to our first query. So if you guys remember from here, our first question was who was the first person landed on the moon, and in the response we have got that the first person to land on the moon was American astronaut Neil Armstrong on July 20, 1969. We check our second request. We ask that how long does it take to reach the Mars, but if you notice the assistant instructions here we have given to the assistant, we ask that you are an unhelpful assistant. So now let's see how the assistant has replied for this query. In the second response, the assistant has replied that it varies depending on the specific condition of the journey and the technology being used. So you see here the assistant has not responded a helpful reply because we instructed that you are not a helpful assistant. So now we have got this response in the form of text. Now let's see how we can extract these responses individually, and since we are only interested in this content which is the exact response, so we will just extract this content from this response for each element. So for that, what I'll do is that first I'll import JSON and then I'll loop through all these responses. So what I'm doing is that here I'm getting the batch response.text, which you guys have already seen here, batch response.text. So this will give us exactly this response. Then I am removing any pre or post spaces, so I'm using this strip method. Then I am splitting by new line. Here you guys can see that these seems like multiple lines, but in reality this is just a single line, but since we don't have enough space, that is why this shows on multiple lines. But in the actual file from the OpenAI, this is exactly one line, and this second response is another line. So I'm splitting by a new line just to get one response when we are looping through the responses. Every time we are looping through this response, we will get one response from this batch of responses. So after splitting the response by line, I am converting that text. Since this is a dictionary in the form of string, when we are looping through this response, in every iteration we will get this dictionary in the form of string. So to convert a string dictionary to the JSON format, I'm using this JSON.loads and then request. So what is the request? Request is actually this one element in the first response, and then the second time the request will be this second response. So I'm calling this request json.loads.request, and once I'm getting this response in the form of JSON, then I can use request.response. So first I'm going to the response key, then I'm go to the body key, and next I should go to the choices. Since the response is on the index 0, I'm using index 0, and this exactly matches the way we were parsing the chat completion responses. So we have choices, 0, message, and then content, and then I'm putting 2 new lines. So let's print this and see how we have got every response for our batch of requests. So here you can see that we have got each of the response individually on separate lines. So just to revise that, the output.json file, so this comes in the form of JSON-L file, and every line will have one response, and that response will be matching to the batch of requests we have submitted initially. So for every request you will get one response. If there are any failures for any request, you can also see the finish reason here. You can also see the status code here by using all these attributes, including this error which is null currently. But if you have any invalid response for any request, you can check it when you are looping through the responses. So any failed request in the batch will have their error information written to an error file. Here it says the error null, but if we have an error for any request, here we should have some file ID, and then using that file ID we will retrieve that file by using this client.files.content to get all the error details related to that response. And one other thing is that batch that does not complete, eventually those batches will be moved to the expired state. So if the job is running continuously and it's stuck for any reasons, and it doesn't complete within the 24 hours time window which we have set here, completion window 24 hour, that batch job will be moved to the expired state eventually. Unfinished requests within that batch are cancelled. So if any request was not finished, that will be moved to the cancel state. In the next video we are going to discuss the OpenAI production best practices. We will go through some theoretical stuff, and we will see what are some of the best practices when we are going to production. So for the testing or for the demo purpose, what we have done till now is perfectly fine. But if you need to move your OpenAI project to the production, you need to follow some best practices recommended by the OpenAI.